Okay, let's think about something that feels almost like a permanent fixture in U.S. foreign policy. The strong support for Israel.
Yeah.
It's been there for decades.
Well, absolutely. Seems almost unquestionable sometimes.
Well, when you stop and think, why? I mean, why does the world's most powerful country so consistently prioritize the interests of this one other nation?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's exactly what we're diving deep into today. Our main source here is that, well, pretty famous book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy.
Right, by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt.
Exactly. And these aren't just any commentators. We're talking top political scientists.
University of Chicago, Harvard,
Right.
heavyweight thinkers, especially in that realist school of international relations. They tend to focus on national interest, power, that kind of thing.
Precisely. And there's that interesting backstory, too. The book was apparently first commissioned by The Atlantic.
Oh, right. But they didn't end up publishing it.
No.
Hmm.
It eventually came out elsewhere, which, kind of hints that the topic itself is maybe a bit sensitive, or at least seen as controversial, definitely significant.
Yeah, that definitely signals something. So, our mission today, just to be clear for everyone listening,
Yeah.
we're not here to judge the book or even agree or disagree with it necessarily. We want to understand its arguments,
Yeah.
how Mearsheimer and Walt analyze what they call the Israel Lobby.
Exactly. They approach it analytically, like you'd study any interest group trying to influence policy. Think, the energy lobby, big pharma, groups like that. They aim for a detached look.
A detached look that still caused a massive reaction when it was published.
Oh, absolutely. A real firestorm. Accusations of anti-Semitism were thrown around, questions about their research methods.
Yeah, it got heated. So it's really important for you, the listener, to know upfront. Mearsheimer and Walt present this as a scholarly work, an academic analysis.
That's their framing, yes.
Okay, so let's get into it. What exactly do they mean when they talk about the Israel Lobby? Is it one specific organization?
No, and that's a key point in their definition. It's not a single formal group. They describe it more as a loose coalition, a network
A network of what?
of different organizations and also influential individuals. What ties them together, according to the book, is a shared dedication to promoting Israel's interests here in the U.S.
Okay, so a coalition. And how does this coalition actually work? What tactics do Mearsheimer and Walt say they use?
Well, they lay out a range of activities. Many are pretty standard lobbying techniques, things you'd recognize.
Like what?
Things like writing open letters to shape opinions, pushing for specific resolutions in Congress, putting out press releases to influence media coverage.
Getting their message out there.
Right. And also really engaging in policy debates, sometimes dominating them.
Right?
They also talk about the role of think tanks producing research that supports the cause, shaping the intellectual environment.
And direct contact too, I assume? Meetings, that sort of thing?
Definitely. Organizing meetings with officials, members of Congress. Direct advocacy is key.
Does the book name specific groups as being particularly central to this network?
It does. It identifies two as being especially important. AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. They're seen as core players.
Got it. Now, what's the underlying idea, the core belief that the authors argue makes this lobby so effective? Why has it succeeded, in their view?
Their central argument here is that this coalition has been incredibly successful at convincing many Americans, and crucially policymakers, that U.S. interests and Israeli interests are essentially the same thing, virtually identical.
And Mearsheimer and Walt challenge that idea.
They do.
Yep.
They argue that while there might have been strong strategic alignment during the Cold War, against the Soviet Union,
Sure, that makes sense.
that rationale largely disappeared after the Soviet Union collapsed. Yet the policy of strong support continued, which suggests to them that something else is driving it. They argue this alignment isn't nearly as self-evident today.
Okay, so if the authors are saying these interests aren't automatically aligned anymore, how does this perception of alignment get maintained? What about like regular American public opinion?
That's a really interesting part of their analysis.
Yeah.
They talk about the broader American public, characterizing the majority perhaps as Jacksonian, more focused on domestic stuff, maybe less deeply engaged in foreign policy details day to day.
Okay.
And they argue this relative, maybe indifference, allows a smaller but very passionate and well-organized minority who care deeply about Israel to have an outsized influence, especially on politicians,
How so?
particularly in close elections. If demonstrating strong support for Israel can swing some key votes or unlock campaign donations, then politicians have a strong incentive to adopt that stance.
Yeah, you definitely see that playing out. It feels almost like a requirement now for presidential hopefuls to state their unwavering support.
Exactly. The book highlights this dynamic. Candidates often seem to compete over who can sound more pro-Israel. You mentioned the last presidential election. Think about how both main candidates really emphasized their pro-Israel positions.
Right. Wasn't there that moment where Trump explicitly said he wouldn't be neutral between Israel and the Palestinians?
Yes, that's a perfect example of the dynamic Mearsheimer and Walt describe. Rejecting neutrality becomes a way to signal that strong support.
We should probably pause here, though, and just state clearly lobbying itself is legal, right? It's part of how the U.S. system works.
Oh, absolutely. That's a vital point. Lobbying is a legitimate part of democratic politics. You have tons of powerful lobbies, ethnic diasporas, the energy sector, weapons
The
manufacturers.
NRA, AARP, lots of them.
Right. Mearsheimer and Walt absolutely acknowledge that. Their argument isn't that lobbying is illegitimate, but that this particular lobby, AIPAC especially, is unusually effective and influential, specifically on Middle East foreign policy.
And the book also asks a pretty pointed question about who this lobby actually speaks for, doesn't it?
It does. Mearsheimer and Walt raised the question of whether the lobby's positions always align with the views of the wider American public.
Or even potentially the majority of American Jews.
Exactly. They point to polling data suggesting that many American Jews actually favor, say, a two-state solution and are often opposed to military conflict as the main approach. These views, they argue, sometimes differ from the harder-line positions advocated by parts of the lobby.
So if the authors argue the interests aren't identical, and the lobby maybe doesn't represent everyone, what do they see as the downsides for the U.S.? What are the costs of this close alliance, according to them?
This is really the core of their critique. They argue that this unwavering support, which they attribute largely to the lobby's influence, has been costly for the United States.
How so? Costly in what way?
In several ways. They suggest it damages relationships with Arab and Muslim nations, fuels anti-Americanism in the region, and makes it harder for the U.S. to achieve other foreign policy goals there.
Like complicating diplomacy or counterterrorism efforts?
Potentially, yes. And then there's the straightforward financial cost, the billions in aid provided to Israel each year, which they argue is a significant burden on U.S. taxpayers.
Okay, that's a pretty strong argument they're making. But surely it's not the only perspective out there. Their view isn't universally accepted.
Not at all. And that's important to remember. Other analysts, like the review you mentioned earlier, would say, okay, yes, the lobby is influential, undeniably.
Right.
But attributing U.S. policy in the Middle East only to the lobby might be too simple. It's reductionist. There are other long-standing American interests at play.
Like what?
Well, the classic one is ensuring a stable supply of oil from the region. That's been a U.S. priority for decades. And also just managing the complex balance of power between all the different countries there. Those factors matter too.
So it's complex. It seems like Mearsheimer and Walt made a conscious choice to focus very specifically on the lobby aspect, maybe with a particular academic style.
Yes, I think that's fair. Their stated aim was academic rigor. They trip hard to avoid emotional language or moral judgments, focusing instead on analyzing influence and interests.
Which might explain why the book is, well, quite long and detailed.
It could be, yes, that
Oh.
very cautious, detailed approach. And we also have to keep in mind it was published back in 2007. The world, especially the Middle East, hasn't exactly stood still since then.
True. Some specifics might be dated, but does the core argument still hold relevance today, do you think, looking at, say, the last decade or two of U.S. policy?
I think its enduring value is that it provides this really meticulously researched framework for asking critical questions. It forces you to examine that U.S.-Israel relationship, question whether the support always serves broad U.S. interests, and think about how lobbying, money, and elected officials interact. It definitely makes you think about the drivers behind foreign policy.
So if we had to boil down the central thesis of the Israel Lobby and U.S. foreign policy, what would it be?
I'd say the core argument is this. A powerful, well-organized network significantly shapes U.S. Middle East policy, pushing it in a direction that Mearsheimer and Walt argue may not always align with overall American strategic interests.
And they argue this happens largely within the normal rules of American democracy.
Exactly. It operates openly, using legitimate lobbying techniques. The debate is really about the impact and the consequences of that influence.
So even with all the controversy and acknowledging other factors are involved, it remains a significant book for understanding this whole dynamic.
Definitely. It's thought-provoking, whether you ultimately agree with all its conclusions or not. It challenges assumptions.
It really does. So thinking about everything we've discussed from the book, What are the potential long-term implications for the U.S., for the Middle East, of this relationship as Mearsheimer and Walt describe it? That's maybe the final question to leave with you, our listener. What does this analysis make you question about how foreign policy gets made?